This podcast is owned and operated by the RCR Association, a private third party to the Department of National Defense. The content of this podcast is the responsibility of the RCR Association and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Government of Canada. The official emblems of the regiment are used with the permission of Regimental Headquarters, the RCR.
Sergeant saying I've been in the Canadian Armed Forces now for almost 30 years, and people often ask me how did I get interested in urban operations and urban warfare history. And I've even had a couple of people challenge me on social media, like, "You're a Canadian. What could you possibly know about urban warfare?" As if my nationality or my citizenship had something to do with my knowledge or lack of knowledge on a subject. So this is my resume. I've always been at the right place at the right time with units who have allowed me to participate in or lead urban operations or urban operations training. And so it started with when I was with 3 RCR. And we just came back from the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the commanding officer at the time, Lieutenant Colonel, now retired Major General Dennis Thompson, launched the entire battalion on an urban operations training program that lasted for several months. And it was all about the individual skills, the platoon level skills. So learning how to stack and enter and clear rooms and walk down hallways and boost your buddies through windows and all that. And then I was posted to the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, Princess Louise's, which is an Army Reserve unit out of Hamilton. And I had a company commander there approach me and ask if, he said, "Jay, I'm really interested in urban operations, and I'd like to do an urban operations training package." And I was like, "Well, what a quinky dink. I just finished, almost a year-long training package with 3 RCR. So as the operations officer of the unit, I was able to plan and coordinate and execute a number of urban operations training exercises. And then when I was with 2 RCR overseas in Afghanistan, on the 15th of April, 2012, we had about 50 or 60 insurgents attack all of the NATO and Afghan National Army camps within the city of Kabul
Wow.
itself. So there I was with the bullets and the rocket propelled grenades and the helicopter gunships flying over my head. And I was like, well, this is great. All the training I had done with the RCR and the Argylls, it was focused on the individual skills, the hands and feet skills. But now I'm a major. Like, what the heck am I supposed to be doing as a major? If I have to go outside the wire with my guys, what am I supposed to do as a major? I didn't have any idea. And so I said to myself, if I get after this alive, I think when I get back home, I'll start professionally developing myself in the planning, the tactics, and the sustainment of urban operations from the combat team to the division level. That's what I need to focus on now because I'm a senior officer. So very fortunately, I was posted to tactics school at CFP Gagetown, and I was able to put together a number of urban operations training packages that focus on the planning, tactics, and sustainment of urban operations at the higher levels. It wasn't the hands and feet stuff. There's lots of people that can do the hands and feet stuff now. I don't need to focus on that. It was all that higher level planning, tactics, sustainment. And I was able to put together urban operations training packages and toots for the Army Tactical Operations course, the Infantry Dismounted Company Commanders course, and the Combat Team Commanders course. And if I had time or the other course officers had time, they'd give me anywhere from 2 to 6 days to teach these packages. And very luckily, we had Fredericton, which is like only 15 minutes away. So I could stage out of the Royal New Brunswick Regiment armories and we could do toots right in downtown Fredericton itself, which is absolutely fantastic. When I was at the tactics school, I was able to go part-time to the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, and I was able to acquire my Master of Arts in Military History, and my thesis was focused on the urban battle of Ortona. And then while I was also at the tactics school, I linked up with my American urban operations brother from another mother, John Spencer. He's the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, and he's now the executive director of the Urban Warfare Institute
Wow.
down in the United States. And when John found out that I was teaching urban operations planning, tactics, and sustainment at the higher level, and because I've been a passionate military historian for many years, I was also integrating a lot of urban warfare history into my lectures. He immediately partnered up with me, and now because of that, we've co-written and co-produced a number of articles and case studies and podcasts for the Modern War Institute at West Point.
That's incredible.
And because of John, thank you. And I was able to link up with the United States Army 40th Infantry Division, the deputy commander, Brigadier General Robert Wooldridge, a very nice gentleman. he founded the Urban Operations Planners course, which is focused on the planning, tactics, and sustainment of urban operations at the higher level. And so they founded the Urban Warfare Center, where I became a senior fellow. And I also became a senior instructor on the Urban Operations Planners course down in Los Angeles. And I've taught on that. That's an annual course that they've taught for the past 3 years. Unfortunately, with Brigadier General Wooldridge retiring, that course is now pretty much gone. And so we're trying to restart the course through John Spencer's Urban Warfare Institute. Now I'm with Canadian Army Doctrine Training Center now. And when I got on the ground here 3 years ago, my immediate superior said, well, if you're such a passionate guy about urban operations, maybe you can write our urban operations doctrinal publications. So morale skyrocketed on day one of landing at BC at the Army Doctrine Center. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been rewriting our urban operations doctrinal publications. I've worked with the former editor-in-chief of the Canadian Army Journal, Dr. Aditi Malhotra, through a number of conversations. I'm now the guest editor for 2 urban warfare themed editions of the Canadian Army Journal. The first one was published just before Christmas, and the second one should be published within the next month or so. And then over the past few years, because I'm so passionate about the topic and because I'm an urban warfare historian, for the past few years, I've gone all over the world, both online and in person, and I've attended urban operations conferences where I've been the keynote speaker. I've gone to doctrinal publication review boards. I've had other militaries and other humanitarian organizations send me their urban operations materials and products so I can review it. And for the past few years, also, I've gone online and been all over the world, online and in person, to do exactly this, to talk about urban operations, to talk about urban warfare history. And I've done that for a number of militaries and other organizations around the world now. So now 30 years in, and it's the odd thing is it's never been my primary job. This is like, my job is not to focus on urban operations. I've always had other jobs. It's just, I very thankfully had colonels who were very supportive of my following through this passion. And so 24 years now, professional, personal, practical, instructional, academic, historical, doctrinal, urban operations experience, knowledge, training, and writing. I realized the slides, and this looked like a self-licking ice cream cone right now. But in all honesty, as much as I have all this experience and knowledge in writing and historical background, I don't consider myself an expert in urban operations. I find that this environment is so complex and so challenging that I don't think anybody can be an expert in it, because I learned something new about how to conduct urban operations and something new about urban warfare history every year, every month, every week, every day. So I can't really claim to be an expert in it. I'm just a passionate student of urban operations and a passionate student of urban warfare history. I try to ground myself, keep myself a little more humble, because I'm learning something new about this, very on a routine basis.
For a guy like me to like see this slide and in particular, like, you're writing at the bottom there where it says in 24 years of professional, personal, practical, instructional, academic, historical, doctrinal experience, knowledge, training, and writing. That for me articulates it and in as a clear as possible way, these kind of facets, these elements that go into the holistic idea of somebody who is deeply a student and to the rest of us, you're a master in the field.
All right. So I was at the tactics school for 7 years. And so we teach the estimate and we teach how to write operational orders. So I always like a concept of operations paragraph to set the tone. So the intent, what I'm going to do is going to talk about points to improve and sustain from past and present urban operations so we can develop our soldiers of the RCR for future urban operations and training, and scheme maneuver how I'm going to do it. It's going to be a verbal discussion using this PowerPoint. Because I am an urban warfare historian, I'm going to use a number of historical case studies to support the points. And you can see the 4 phases, basically the main teach points. Main effort, phases 2 and 3, and then the end state. Fellow Royals will be able to have a better understanding of urban operations and will be able to conduct future urban operations and training with better knowledge on the subject. All right. So I'll start off with the introduction. I realize it's a bit of a text-heavy slide, but Lieutenant Colonel retired Lou DeMarco was written this fantastic book, Sergeant Singh, called Concrete Hill. And I actually interviewed Colonel DeMarco for a podcast for the Urban Warfare Project.
Wow.
And but Colonel DeMarco's got it right. Yes.
Wow.
And Colonel DeMarco's got it right. Urban warfare is becoming more prevalent, and it's going to become even more so in the future, I'll suggest. Right now, Sergeant Singh, it all depends on the resources that you read, but anywhere from 50 to 65% of the world's population is currently living in an urban environment. By the time the next generation of children grow up to become adults, the resources predicted anywhere from 75 to 85% of the world's population is going to be urbanized or living in an urban environment. And, you can take statistics and skew them any way you want, but something tells me if the majority of the world's population is going to be living in an urban environment, we're probably going to be conducting urban operations. But that's not the only reason why. The other reason why is we suck at this. We're not very good at it. Well, we're getting better, and that's the points to improve and sustain. You'll see later on. We're getting better at it, but because of the complexities and the challenges of operating in this environment, and because our adversaries know that there's complexities and challenges in operating in the urban environment, they try to suck us into this environment because they know that it can be very resource intensive. It can be very casualty inducing. And so because our adversaries know this, they're going to try to suck us in to the urban environment to fight us. I'm not slandering the urban ops instructor course. When I say we suck at this, I'm not saying the urban ops instructors course is poor. It's not. It's a great course. It's run down at the infantry school. The challenges with it, of course, is that it only teaches the hands and feet skills. And because it's taught at the infantry school, a lot of people think, well, urban operations is just an infantry thing, when it's not. And you'll see my arguments later on with regards to that. So we do need to get smarter on urban operations at all levels. And again, I'll reinforce that with the points to improve and sustain later on. Okay, so we'll go to our points to improve. So when I mean points to improve, I'm talking about what's been done in the past and the present that we need to improve so that we can get better urban operations in the future. So my first point is we need to learn from the past to become better in the present. Otherwise, the future is going to be the same as most of the past. So starting saying people have been around for centuries and cities have been around for centuries and urban warfare has been around for centuries, except for maybe a brief period during the 18th and 19th centuries when it was all about forming up in big groups in open fields and, firing your muskets in order to get the maximum firepower. But in one way, form, or another, urban operations, urban warfare has been around for centuries, whether it was sieges or it was actually maneuver or whatever, right? And so there really is no excuse for not knowing how to conduct urban operations. Modern urban operations, which is basically what I consider everything from the Second World War to the present, where we have a peer-on-peer conventional fighting in the urban environment. I mean, that's been around now for 80 plus years, basically everything from, like I said, from the Second World War to the present. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of products, case studies, articles, books, podcasts, etc., that will allow you to get smart on the past when it comes to urban operations, on urban warfare history. Colonel T.E. Lawrence was a British officer who served in the Middle East during the Great War. And he said, with 2,000 years of examples behind us, we have no excuse for not fighting well. Well, I'll paraphrase Colonel Lawrence. With 80 plus years of modern urban operations and urban warfare history behind us, we have no excuse for not fighting well. As you can see, through this, this brief, this brief presentation of historical battles that you're seeing on your screen, there's no excuse. There are literally hundreds, if not hundreds of articles, case studies, books, journals, podcasts that discuss this particular subject. The key is that if you're going to go to the past to study urban warfare history in order to get better at the present and the future, the key is to make sure that you pull back or pull out the applicable lessons learned. Like you can't take the 1943 Battle of Ortona, pick it up, bring it forward, drop it in 2025 and say, okay, if we do everything the Canadians did at Ortona, we'll win. That's not necessarily true at all. Like you've got to be able to be selective. Okay, which lessons learned from the past are still applicable to 2025, and let's apply those, right? So my good friend John Spencer, who I talked about earlier, John founded the Urban Warfare Project for Modern Warfare 2. And if you need resources, by all means, go to the Urban Warfare Project, because John, for the past few years, has over 100 podcasts and has written and produced a number of articles and case studies on the Urban Warfare Project. In fact, right now, John and I, working with our good friend Liam Collins, we've produced 12 historical case studies. And you can see those case studies on the right there. I realize the print is very small, but again, you can go on to the Urban Warfare Project and find those case studies. What happens is when we find a battle that we want to talk about, usually I'll gather all the resources. I'll write a very wholesome first draft of a chapter. And then John and Liam and I have to cut that chapter down to 5,000 words. That's a constraint that's put on us by the editor-in-chief of the Modern Warfare Suit. And we always have an introduction, a battle synopsis, the lessons learned, and a conclusion. But when it comes to the lessons learned, John, Liam, and I have a very vigorous debate and discussion, like which lessons here do we want to make sure that are still applicable to today. We try to pick 2 strategic, 2 operational, 2 tactical lessons learned so that we cover the whole gamut of the operational levels, right? And so we try to be very the lessons that move forward.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but for the junior audiences here that aren't familiar with the context of tactical, operational, strategic level, how could you, I don't know, briefly describe the differences between the three here?
Oh, certainly. So the 3 levels of operations are tactical, operational, and strategic. Strategic, obviously, is where we have our very senior politicians and our senior military leaders apply the objectives that we need to meet as a nation. And then the operational level is where, okay, they understand the strategic objectives, so they come up with operational plans in order to meet those strategic objectives. And then the tactical units actually execute those operational plans in order to meet those strategic objectives as well. So those are the 3 levels of operations that we have within Western militaries. And so that's why John and Liam and I try to focus on 2 strategic, 2 operational, 2 tactical lessons learned. Again, it's not just about hands and feet, right? Yeah, that's important, but it's not just about what Private What's His Pickle has to do. It's also, what does Lieutenant Colonel What's His Pickle have to do? What does General What's His Pickle 2 have to do when it comes to planning and executing urban operations? That's why it's important that all those 3 levels are discussed. And that's why we include them, right? So picking the applicable lessons learned. And if you don't know which lessons are good and which lessons are no longer functioning, then you got to talk to people and say, okay, would this work? Would this work? Or is this not going to work? And you can talk to me, and I'll be happy to discuss it. Another resource. Remember, I was talking about the Urban Operations Planners course down in Los Angeles. There, Sergeant Singh, Brigadier General Wooldridge's staff had created the Urban Operations Electronics Library, and General Wooldridge said to me, "Jay, can you take it over?" And I'm like, "Sure, sir." And I dumped 20 years of resource collection and research into the Urban Operations Electronic Library. Now that the Urban Ops Planners course is no longer functioning, John Spencer is trying to take all the intellectual property from this website, move it over to the Urban Warfare Institute site. But this is something I try to update every 2 to 3 months with the latest articles and books and podcasts that come out. So here's another resource that literally has hundreds and hundreds of books and case studies and journal articles and podcasts that you can listen to get yourself smart on urban operations. And then finally, I mentioned working now with Army Doctrine Center. I've rewritten the higher level urban operations doctrinal publication, and I punched that out last September for a review, and I'm still making amendments to it. And so again, if you need to get smart, if you're Canadian and you want to get smart on what I think you need to do to be successful in urban operations, and then read the draft doctrinal publication. It's not approved yet, but there's the draft, at least that's out. So again, let's learn from the past to become better in the present so that we can be good in the future. Otherwise, we're going to make the same mistakes that some militaries have done in the past, and that's not good. All right, so we need to educate the uneducated and ignore the ignorant. So for some of this, I'm using my Irish urban operations brother from another mother, Stu Lyle. Stu is the urban operations research lead for the UK Ministry of Defense Science Technology Laboratory, DSTL. And Stu's a defense scientist who's also very passionate about the subject. So I borrow some of his points from his urban myth busting lecture. So we need to educate the uneducated. There's a lot of urban legends out there, and we need to get people educated to make them understand that some of those urban legends don't apply. So here's the first one. Cities must be isolated and bypassed. Maybe. In certain circumstances, maybe, yes, you can isolate and bypass a city. They used to say this a lot because it's always resource intensive. It could be casualty inducing. So why not just isolate and bypass? Yes, maybe you can do that in certain contexts, but I was talking about the rapid urbanization of the world earlier, and because cities have always been and still remain strategic objectives because of their political, economic, industrial, social, cultural, religious value, it's almost now impossible to avoid fighting in cities. Sometimes you can, but most of the time, I argue you cannot, and you're going to have to get smart on how to conduct urban operations in this environment. So that's the first urban legend that we need to educate you. Second, you can't use armored fighting vehicles, tanks, or helicopters in urban warfare. Yes, you can, and you have to if you want to achieve victory and achieve it quicker. I was talking to a good friend of mine a couple years ago. He's an armored officer, And when he found out that I was passionate about urban operations, the first thing he said was, "Oh, you can't use tanks in urban operations." I'm like, "Yes, you can." He's like, "No, you can't." And I'm like, "Yeah, you can. In fact, you have to. You just have to adjust your TTPs. You have to make sure your TTPs are good to go." This project, he was
From, sir?
well, because in the past, what's happened is that there's been certain urban warfare battles where the wrong TTPs were applied, and everybody looked at that and goes, "Ha, that's why you can't use tanks and armored fighting vehicles in urban warfare." But what they failed to do was to look at all the other urban warfare battles, like these ones, where armor was actually quite successful in the urban operation because the appropriate TTPs were applied. Like, look at all these battles that I've studied, and armor was successfully used in all of these battles. In Mogadishu, they didn't have any armor, and that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why the Americans failed in that particular battle. But when I'm talking about the poor TTPs, I'm talking about this. Okay, when the troops are doing the conga line behind the tanks there, like this is not correct. This is not a symbiotic relationship of protection. Okay, so the adversary can sneak up on those tanks and those troops and be able to fire and destroy those tanks and those troops. Right. So same with this. These U.S. Marines in battle way doing the conga line behind the tank. No, I don't want to see that. What I want to see. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm going to go to this example here, Sergeant Singh.
Okay.
This comes right from. This comes from. Can you see my screen there, Sergeant Singh? Yeah. Okay. So this is a lone tank driving through downtown Mariupol. It's a Russian tank driving through downtown Mariupol with no infantry, engineer, or artillery protection. Well, you can see here the Ukrainian anti-armor teams are just lighting this tank up. Okay. The tactic that has to be applied is that the dismounted infantry engineers are actually ahead of the tank. They're working through the buildings, or if they're on the streets, they're making sure nothing's going to pop out to destroy that tank. And the tanks, meanwhile, are firing down range. Now, I've been behind a tank when it fires live ammunition. It's not pleasant. So ideally, you want your troops in the buildings, clearing those buildings. So those troops, those dismounted troops clearing the buildings ahead of the tank are protecting the tank. And meanwhile, the tank is protecting those troops by firing down range at the adversary's targets, at the adversary's the defensive positions. Right. That's the proper tactic to employ. I know it's intuitive to have the troops line up behind the tank, but all that does is get the tank and the troops destroyed because the enemy is able to sneak up. Right. So you can see here, this Russian tank is just getting pummeled by the anti-armor. And, there's the one crew member you can see at the bottom who's crawling away. And another crew member is going to rejoin us in a moment here. But, yeah. Oh, there he is right there. He just came in on the right side. Yeah. So, I mean, this is not the proper TTP at all. Right. So that is not acceptable. So a symbiotic relationship where the infantry and the engineers are protecting the armor and the artillery, and the armor and the artillery are protecting the infantry and the engineers by firing at targets down range. You can see the Argyle and Sutherland Hiners of Canada here. You can see with the South Alberta Regiment, the tanker from the South Alberta Regiment peeking his tank around the corner so he could fire down range. Now the Argyles are running forward, clear those buildings while the tank is providing protective cover. That's good TTPs there. Same with these British soldiers from the Gordon Highlanders. You see, they're not behind the tank. They're protecting the flank by looking down this alley. And I can only hope that there's more Gordon Highlanders around the corner protecting those tanks as they advance. Right? Those are the good TTPs I want to see. You can't use helicopters. Helicopters already get shot down, and everybody references Black Hawk Down. Yeah, I get it. On the 3rd of October, there were 3 Black Hawks that got shot down that day. But again, it's because the helicopter pilots and the helicopter air crews were not employing the proper TTPs. When I mentioned earlier, Sergeant Singh, I witnessed the urban battle of Kabul there on the 15th of April, 2012. And like I said, we had helicopter gunships in that fight. We had Eurotiger helicopter gunships. That's what you see on top right there. Out at Kabul International Airport. When the insurgents attacked all of our bases and camps, we spooled up 4 of those helicopter gunships, and the pilots were very smart. They were extremely high in the air. And then when a target was identified, they would swoop down, they would engage the target, and then they would get right back up out of very quickly. And so absolutely fantastic TTPs. I do have a bit of a funny story. So one of my electrical mechanical engineers, Medical Steve Follett, he and I were, as the bullets and the RPGs are flying over our heads, he and I are pulling the front entrance duty. We're pulling security duty at the entrance of our bunker. And we had one of these Euro Tiger gunship helicopters fly about 100 meters over our head. And it flew about 100 meters away when suddenly those guys saw a group of insurgents running up the side of the road beside our camp. And the gunship turned, and that 30 millimeter chain gun started barking. And you could see boom, 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 boom. You could see all the chain and the link and the casings fall out of the bottom. And I remember saying to Master Follett, I was like, holy Jesus, whoever's going to be on the receiving end of that's not going to be happy. And Master Follett's from Newfoundland. And of course, they have a very good sense of humor out there. Master Follett replied, yes, sir. That is called having a bad day.
I'm really sorry, sir, to cut you off. Could you just give us some more context? Like, what happened that day?
Well, it was almost the insurgents had decided to attack all the NATO and Afghan National Army camps within the city. So we were going about our daily routine when around 12:30 in the afternoon, suddenly we heard the gunshots and the RPGs, and suddenly the alarms went off, and we had to get under cover while we figured out what was going on. And so because it was an operational tour in which we were the advisors. So it was largely the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police that were taking care of the insurgents. So we were just acting as advisors. So as a result, we spooled up the helicopters to support them. But my main point here is that the gunship air crews were very smart with their tactics and techniques and procedures. They weren't hovering 100 meters above the city the entire time. They were extremely high up, would swoop down, engage the target, and get back up again. And then around 5:30 in the afternoon, 33 of the insurgents had been killed. There was one Afghan National Police officer killed. And at 5:30, things were stood down. There was continued mopping up of pockets of resistance throughout the remainder of the night. But other than that, that was pretty much the summation of the whole battle. Urban combat produces higher casualty rates. Usually, yes, it does. Not necessarily all the time. It all depends on the operational plans, the TTPs, and the personal protective equipment, the PPE, that you're wearing. The environment itself is challenging. You've got concrete, brick, stone, steel, glass, wood. That's all harder on the human body than dirt. And, you've got soldiers, falling out of buildings or being crushed by walls that are collapsing. There's also usually a higher number of psychological casualties, mental health casualties, because why is that? Because it's close quarter battle. Like your enemy. I mean, don't we have it easier? Not easy, but easier in a rural setting when the enemy's 200 feet away. You can look through your scope and pull the trigger. Well, in urban operations, because there's the density of the urban terrain allows for cover and concealment, the adversary could be in the next room, in the next down the hall, in the next building, across the street. So the distances between the friendly and the adversary forces are considerably shorter. And so, you walk into a room and literally your adversary is right in front of you and you're shooting or stabbing or choking that enemy to death. That has psychological effects as well. And so I've seen throughout my study of urban warfare history, there's a lot more psychological casualties, mental health casualties because of people killing each other at very close range. So urban combat can produce higher casualty rates. And I've seen some urban warfare battles where, the attackers, the defenders were doing everything right, and yet they still suffered high casualties. And I've seen other warfare battles where the attackers, the defenders were doing everything right, and they had low casualties. There's a number of factors that influence it, but we can't just have a blanket statement that it always produces higher casualties. Not necessarily. It does in most battles, but not in all battles. And I find too that usually the defenders are usually suffer the higher casualty rates, vice the attackers. I've seen that throughout urban warfare history. That's a theme throughout urban warfare history as well. Logistic demands are higher in urban combat.
Sorry. Sometimes when I find myself involved in training, I have these moments where I try to foster a sense of how do I describe it? Like interest in the training from the audience that I'm working with, and sometimes I get them to take it very seriously and have
Good.
like a level of respect for it.
Good.
I usually do end up informing them or or using that legend that urban combat will probably produce a significant casualty rate in your platoon and company, to expect a third of us to become casualties. And it usually gets their attention pretty quick. And then I get into my next line, which is like, you're going to need to pay attention so you know when to take over when I go down. And
That's fantastic.
I can't help but feel that when I read literature like House to House and some other books, with regards to like the Iraq War, it was very apparent that many of their NCOs were casualties in the battle engagements, especially when you consider putting yourself in a position where you are leading from the front across the line of departure. So much risk. I find enough, I don't know if 3D dimensional, a 3D battle space, I don't know if that's the correct way to phrase it as well. But yeah, I have a sense of admiration and respect for urban warfare, some of it out of fear of knowing how dangerous it is.
That's healthy. That's healthy to have that respect and that fear. You mentioned House to House by Staff Sergeant David Lavia.
Correct.
Of course, he fought at the Second Battle of Fallujah. And, from Second Fallujah, there were some Army and Marine rifle companies that, even though they had a good operational plan and good TTPs, there were some companies that had 40% casualty rates. Now, normally in the Second World War, casualty rates could be anywhere from 2 to 5%. But in urban operations, you can have, 3 to 6 times the amount. You can, not necessarily all the time, but you can. And so there's a perfect example, Second Fallujah, where the Americans were doing everything right, and yet they still had 40% casualty rates in some of the rifle companies, right? So it usually does, yes, but not necessarily in all urban battles. And I'm starting to understand now why you won General Vance's award, because that's the direction. If that's the direction you're giving your subordinates, then that's great, because it's very much true. All right, next point: logistic demands are higher in urban combat. Usually, yes, for most consumables. And I'm going to talk about sustainment as one of my points to improve later on. There's some consumables that aren't used a lot of, like fuel tends to be fairly low. If you're doing everything right with precision guided munitions, you don't necessarily use a lot of those, although the Battle of Mosul in 2017 upended that because they were using so many precision guided munitions. And my good friend Amos Fox talks about the precision paradox during the Battle of Mosul. So Amos Fox wrote for the Urban Warfare Project, or for the Modern War Institute, the precision paradox, in which the Iraqis became so dependent on the precision guided munitions that were being supplied by the United States during the Battle of Mosul, that what would happen was they would find an Islamic State defensive position. They would drop a precision guided munition on that particular building. The building might not be destroyed, so then the Islamic State fighters would starburst to 2 other buildings. And so then they would drop precision guided munitions on those 2 buildings, and then they would starburst to 5 buildings. And then they would drop precision guided munitions on those 5 buildings because the Iraqis were getting used to the fact that they could call this fire in, and it gave them the confidence to be able to approach and close with and destroy the enemy because they had dropped precision guided munitions on it. But what happened was, you think precision guided munitions are supposed to be meant for a pinpoint target, but the Iraqis were now using precision guided munitions to strike every target, almost as if it was non-conventional, non-precision munitions. And so they were laying waste to the entire city. They were destroying the entire city, right. Almost as if they were using non-precision munitions from artillery, but because they were using all the precision guided munitions. It was this paradox. You're supposed to be using these for pinpoint targets, but if you're using it on literally every building in the city, all you're doing is this creeping wave of destruction. So Amos called that the precision paradox, right? And so ideally, if you're using precision guided munitions, they're considerably more expensive, by the way. You want to use those sparingly. That's the theory, but then Mosul upset that theory because they were using it for everything. Right? So anyway, logistic demands are usually higher in urban combat for some consumables, and I'll talk about sustainment later on. Force ratios for the attacker have to be higher. That's another urban legend. And what happens is they usually insert numbers. I've seen in some other countries' doctrinal publications where it was like the minimum ratio was 6 to 1, 6 attackers to 1 defender, or it's 9 to 1 or 15 to 1. That is extremely dangerous to just put a minimum number out there. It all depends, the force ratios all depend on the operational plan, the TTPs, the quality of the soldiers, the urban training density, if there's sub-training involved, and the enablers that are being provided, right? So to say, well, you need 6-1 as a minimum, how did they get those numbers? How did they get those numbers? What happens if you don't need 6-1? What happens if you actually do your intelligence preparation of the operational environment and you need 9-1 or you need 11-1, right? So inserting, and when people think of force ratios, they often think of just personnel. I just need more bodies on the ground. And so, but that's dangerous as well, because it's not just about bodies. It's not just about personnel, dismounted personnel. It's also about AFVs and helicopters and supporting arms and other enablers that you can bring to the fight. So don't sit there and give a minimum number and say, well, just as long as we go 8-1, we're good. No, that's dangerous. You could need 16-1. Or you could realize you only need 3-1, right? Like you have to do a good intelligence preparation of the operational environment to do that. So the Battle of Ortona is an example where you had the Royal Canadian Regiment and you had the C-400s Canada. They each had a battalion in the fight, and they were going up against 2 German parachute battalions. So it was 2 battalions versus 2 battalions. How did the Canadians win? Well, one of the many reasons is because they had extra enablers. They had tanks, they had the Royal Canadian Artillery anti-tank guns, they had the indirect fire assets, they had the air defense assets, they had the mortars, and they had the engineers, right? So this tipped the balance. So even though it was technically a 1-to-1 fight, it's 2 battalions, 2 infantry battalions versus 2 German parachute battalions, the balance, the scale was tipped to the Canadians' favor because they brought all these other supporting arms in. Right, so there's so force ratios there were equal, but because
there's a term that I heard once before from somebody that I've met in my career. He worked in CANSOFCOM for a very long time, but he said that there is, I think he considered it, or when he explained it, was like a principle, but the idea of relative superiority is something that conventional forces
that's good.
don't I don't know what the word is, but we don't utilize that kind of principle or philosophy towards our planning.
Right.
And I think when you talk about leveraging your enablers, that's where the force and how many troops you have on the ground doesn't necessarily as matters when you consider the amount of effects you can achieve with your enablers that give you that extra leverage of superiority over your enemy. And I just never forget that conversation, because it felt like I had an aha moment, and every now and then, I have a conversation or I'm involved in a conversation like this one where you hear these concepts and you're like, that sounds like relative superiority.
Yeah, that's a fantastic term. I think I'm going to use that. That's an absolutely fantastic term. But yeah, you're right, and he's right too. It's all about relative superiority. Battle of Aachen, another example where the Americans did a lot of good things right here, and you can see there's not a lot of blue rectangles on the left, but there's a lot of red diamonds on the right. And you can see the Americans only had about approximately 3,500 personnel in this city fight, and the Germans had somewhere, the resources differ as to the exact number, but they had 4,000, 6,500 personnel. So right now you're looking at the red diamonds and going, oh, well, the Germans are clearly, they outnumber the Americans. But once again, that relative superiority you were talking about started saying each battalion commander and each rifle company commander received all these additional assets. So even though there was only 2 infantry battalions, technically 2 infantry battalions that went into this fight initially, there'd be other battalions that were added. Even though the Germans technically outnumbered the Americans when it came to dismounted personnel, the Americans brought all these supporting arms and enablers in, once again tipping the scale so that the Americans could fight this fight using all of those supporting arms and enablers to support the infantry and the engineers as they fought their way forward, right? So in this case, the force ratios were in favor of the Germans, but the Americans brought in the supporting arms and enablers. So please don't use 6-1, 8-1, 12-1, 33-1. Make sure you do a good IPOE of your environments to determine that number, because you may not need that many, especially if you have a lot of supporting arms and enablers. Oh, I hear this all the time. Defenders always have the advantage in urban operations. Defenders always have the advantage. No, they have the initial advantage because they know the terrain, they set up the defense positions, got it. But usually, throughout urban warfare history, I can count on my one hand how many times the defenders have won an urban operations battle. And usually because the attacker's operational plan and TTPs were so flawed that it gave the victory to the defenders. Most urban warfare battles, the attackers win. Now, I'm not suggesting that they don't have to use a lot of resources, and I'm not suggesting that they didn't incur a lot of casualties. There were cases where the attackers won, but they used a lot of resources and had a high number of casualties. But normally, once the attackers figure out what they're doing and they have a good operational plan and good TTPs, or if they start with those right from the very beginning, they usually win the urban warfare fight. So down teaching in Los Angeles in the urban operations planners course, and I kept hearing other instructors, "Oh, defenders have the advantage. Defenders have the advantage." And so I went and wrote up on the whiteboard a number of the key urban battles that have occurred throughout history. There's certainly a lot more than this, but I wrote just the ones that are more well known. And you can see there that the attackers won majority. The attackers won all of these battles, right? So the defenders have the initial advantage. But once the attackers sort themselves out, or if they've got themselves good to go at the very beginning of that fight, it's usually the attackers win, like any other environment. The attackers have the initiative.
Can you describe to us oftentimes what victory looks like? Is victory, generally speaking, the surrender of the enemy, or are we talking about total conquest of your enemy? Like domination, destruction?
Well, it all depends. Yeah, it depends on the context. Are you strictly looking at attrition and body count numbers, in which you've killed more of them, or are you talking about possession of the urban terrain, as an example? Okay, if we're able to physically possess the entire city, the majority of the city, does that count as victory? It all depends on what the strategic goals are and what the operational objectives are. The first battle of Grozny, for example, the first battle of Grozny, in which the Chechen defenders really put up a superb defense for the first 3 or 4 days, and then once the Russians realized their errors and mistakes, they eventually went on the attack with a better operational plan and better TTPs. But in that particular fight, the Russians considered victory the ability to possess the entire city. So once that fight went on into the later days of January 1995 into the first days of February, the Chechens eventually withdrew from the city altogether. So now the Russians consider that a victory. Whereas there's been other urban warfare battles where it was just, well, if we attrit enough of the adversary, we'll have won. So it all depends on the context and the objectives of both parties. All right. Urban combat takes more time. Usually, yes. As an example, I saw this in the Battle of Ortona and during the Second Battle of Fallujah. It usually takes a supported platoon, so a platoon that has armor, artillery, and engineer support. It'll take them about 45 to 60 minutes to clear a one-level house with a basement. So if they're not supported, if it's just an infantry platoon with no support, it'll probably take about 90 minutes. Now, if you start adding up the time, well, okay, if it takes a platoon with armor, engineer, artillery support about an hour to clear a house, a one-level house with a basement, well, you've got 3 houses, that's 3 hours. You've got 6 houses, that's 6 hours or so. That's an entire day of fighting right there. And if there's X amount of houses and buildings on a street, X number of streets and number of suburbs and blah, 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 it all depends on how big the town or the city is. Usually urban combat does take more time. But having said that, there's been some urban warfare battles where the adversary didn't have good TTPs, or there was very few adversary, or it was a small town or village. And so the urban battles only took, a couple days. So you can have a couple days, you can have a week, you can have a few weeks, you can have a few months, you can have a few years. But it usually does take more time. These are all the urban warfare battles and their dates that from basically from the Spanish Civil War to the present that I keep as a reference. So if I have to look up a date really quickly, I've got it. And you can see some of these battles, they took just a day or two. Some of them took a week, some of them took 4 weeks, some of them took several months, some of them took years. But usually, because of the density of the three-dimensionality of the urban terrain and the subterranean systems involved, you will take a lot more time. And so I argue that time is really a resource. You have to account for a lengthy, because if you're doing this, if you're conducting urban operations, it's a very slow, deliberate process in order to clear those rooms, clear those buildings, clear those subterranean systems, and work your way through the city. So it can be very time consuming. So that's an urban legend that we need to That's probably pretty much true, actually. Okay, I said we have to educate the uneducated and ignore the ignorant. So there's a small group out there that for some reason don't like the urbanistas, this clique, this urbanista clique. And so sometimes they'll write very foolish or not very grounded works. And this is an example where these two gentlemen here wrote this absolutely awful piece on, they were trying to say that the city is neutral and that it doesn't necessarily favor the defenders. But unfortunately, these two gentlemen here, they did attempt to provide a few solutions to overcome the challenges of urban combat, but their arguments were taken out of context. Some of their arguments were contradictory. They made some really gross assumptions. They used really outdated historical examples. And the two gentlemen talk about adopting the strongest gang model, where, act like a gang would in an urban area, avoid division level maneuver, just swarm the enemy, move fast, use less rules, use less combined arms, and you're good to go. And I don't think, well, first of all, you'd have to question the legal and moral implications of referring to professional soldiers as gang members, which I don't really appreciate. And not only that, but just to move faster and act with fewer rules and use less combined arms, like that just gets people killed. You can ask the Russians at First Battle of Grozny, because that's exactly what they did. And they said that they conducted extensive research and they attended numerous exercises and talked to a number of urban operations subject matter experts. They didn't talk to John Spencer, I can tell you that. They didn't talk to me or anybody else, I don't think. So John wrote this fantastic rebuttal article that shoots down a lot of the arguments that these two gentlemen made. It's odd that a general with a PhD and a senior officer would write such a horrible article, but it was very ignorant. And it would, if people tried to apply the things that they discuss in their article, you'd get a lot of friendly bodies in the body bags, I can tell you that. So these kind of people who take exception to the urbanistas and our arguments that urban operations is becoming more prevalent, they like to call us the urban exceptionalists because we tend to think that urban operations is the be all and end all, which is not true at all. So we have to ignore these kinds of people and just keep doing what we're doing in order to get smarter on this environment. We still need the generalist and not the specialist approach. And what I mean by this is that Dr. Michael Evans is a gentleman who was born in Wales, but he's down in Australia. He wrote this absolutely fantastic, very thought-provoking piece called City Without Joy, Urban Military Operations in the 21st Century. Now, during the French Indochina War, when the French were in Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, outside the city of Hue, there was a street called the Street Without Joy, because the communist Viet Minh would ambush the French on this street all the time. And so they would incur lots of casualties. So Dr. Evans has renamed it City Without Joy, and he talks about the challenges that we face conducting urban operations in the 21st century. And he puts forth this argument that you have to adopt the generalist approach, not the specialist approach. I can't sit here and put my hand on my heart and go, everybody and their dog has to become an expert in urban operations. Okay, we can't do that. As a military, we have to be prepared to fight in any environment. Urban, rural, Arctic, jungle, mountain. And because that's the responsibility that we have to not only the Canadian government, but the Canadians. So Dr. Evans argues, look, you can't take that specialist approach where you think everybody and their dog has to be a specialist in urban operations. You have to take the generalist approach where given the trends, we should certainly become more educated about urban operations and urban warfare, but not so specialized that we forget how to fight in these other environments, which I think is a very balanced view, and I have to agree with them. Like, as much as I'm here doing the urban operations thing, if the government says to me, Geroux, you're going to go fight in the jungle, I'd be like, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, off I go. Right? So you have to take that generalist approach. I think the British Army is doing this. Yeah, sure, by all means.
What I wanted to say was that I always keep referencing my last deployment when it comes to making this point about being a flexible leader, a flexible infantry element. And it's because before I deployed on Operation Globe, which was a deployment of CMERT, Canadian Medical Emergency Response Team, which had me employed in a role as an infantry sergeant as their force protection in an air medevac context.
Okay. Yeah.
The idea was that we would deploy from a location as Cyprus into Beirut, Lebanon, if required, for a NEO operation. And it would require us being a maneuver element with the land task force maneuver element on the ground as well, in a very urban environment such as Beirut. And the flexibility required for me was interesting because leading up to that, for the last month, arguably 2-month period, we were just doing up to level 3, level 4 live fire training. And then I'm just, like, in the woods the whole time. No real urban, enemy position stuff, that not gate or any of that, right? And then, I one day at work, I get pulled out of the office before Thanksgiving, and I'm informed that, the battalion's being tasked to send a force over for this mission, and that, in 7 days, I might be there. And then next thing you know, in 7 days from the point I was told maybe I'd be going, there's so much more to this story, but from the day I was informed that I might be going to the day me and my section were on an airplane with this task force that just got assembled, 7 days. And now I'm going into an environment where urban is the conditions, right? And so it was like almost like a culture shock for me because I'm not used to this. I don't even have the baseline urban operations training that the CAF facilitates in Gagetown. So for me, and then for my guys, this is my third operational expeditionary deployment. For some of my guys, this is their first. For some of my guys, they barely have a year or two in the army. And I'm trying to nurture them into an attitude of being flexible here. I'm like, guys,
Yes.
shooting, moving, communicating is what we do. This urban environment, do not get like overwhelmed by the idea of how much different it is from what we're used to, but apply the principles, apply the fundamental skills that we would on any other level 3 training we've done up to this point here. As long as we breathe, we assess, we communicate,
Good.
we'll be fine, right? So I found that being in a situation where I just got thrown into this environment I'm not really familiar with, that was the best thing I could do, is just try to leverage the shoot, move, communicate. That was constant through
Good.
any type of training I've done.
Good. I'm
And
starting to understand why.
mm,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, unfortunately, we didn't go forward across the sea, but, um, I think that we were trying to do the best we could to mentally prepare for the change in environment.
Good. Good. Well, that's yeah. And, but that just reinforces the point, right? That you have to be prepared to fight in any environment. But again, Dr. Evans says, given the trends, yeah, okay, let's put some more resources towards urban operations training and urban warfare training, but let's not do it at the expense of the other environments, which I think is smart, a very smart approach. We're doing the hands and feet stuff really well. Unfortunately, it's still counterinsurgency tactics. And I'm going to get into a bit of a rant here. So you go on social media, you see lots of this,
Mhm.
which is great. This is good training. This is good training for the troop. The challenge is that when I see these videos on social media, people are still acting like we're in Iraq or Afghanistan, where we're in a permissive or semi-permissive environment. And these skills work in a semi-permissive or permissive environment. But I'm telling you, if you try to do the stacking outside, if you try to walk across the street really slowly with your rifles up, or you stack outside of a building or a room, in a peer-on-peer conventional conflict in a non-permissible environment, all you're going to do is end up getting a lot of soldiers killed. Stacking is for firewood. Okay. Company Sergeant Major Michael Hall and Special Sergeant First Class Michael Kennedy fought during the Battle of Mogadishu. And even though it was an insurgency, going up against warlords, large scale combat operations can happen just like that, especially in an urban environment. And so these are some of the lessons that they passed on to this particular conference was, you shoot till the enemy goes down. The double tap firing 2 shots is not a guarantee. But interestingly enough, the stack is nothing more than a bunch, which we all know gets people killed and reduces the combat effectiveness of a unit down to 1 man. The team stack is used when entering a room or building, but it is something that is flowed into and never lasts more than 3 seconds. Okay, I don't want to see, if you're fighting in a non-permissible environment against a conventional enemy, walking across the street with your rifle like this, or stacking and waiting for the elbow squeeze or the shoulder squeeze, and you're taking precious seconds. All the enemy's going to do is start shooting through the walls, or they're going to see you out in the open and they're going to start shooting and killing you. Right. And so the solution is a high explosive, or what we use as the primary killer. Before any dismounted infantry engineers go into that room, you're going to have a lot of high explosives going into that building or that room to make sure that the enemy is dead, that the adversary is dead. So I found through my urban warfare historical research, you see the battles at the top there. I call this the pattern. So what you do is you bring in close air support to drop something on the objective, whether it's a house or a building or a subterranean system, whatever. Close air support first, then the artillery, air defense, and mortars, and the indirect and direct fire roles, they put more high explosives into that building or that room. The infantry armor and the engineers approach the objective. Remember, the infantry and the engineers are ahead of the tanks. Tanks are firing down range at the objective, allowing the infantry and the armor to the infantry and the engineers to approach it. That's symbiotic relation protection. And then once they get up to the objective, the engineers breach into it. Ideally, you're not going through the doors and windows because they've got those booby traps, or they've got IEDs on them, or they've got, you know, soldiers ready with rifles and machine guns to shoot you when you go through the doors and windows. So ideally, the artillery, the air defense, the mortars, the armors created a mouse hole for you. You throw the explosives in to breach in the objective, and then infantry and engineers get into the interior and they start clearing the objective using more high explosives, more grenades, more satchel charges, et cetera, et cetera. I've seen it in all these battles and it works. It works. So I'm going to go off on another video from the Russo-Ukrainian war. You can see my screen there starting to sing.
Yes.
Okay, look at this BMP. Look at the amount of firepower that's going down range. That's what I want to see before the infantry and the engineers approach a building. This is what I want to see. I want to see that kind of firepower going into the objective. Okay, and I think you would agree with me starting to saying you'd probably be pretty pleased to see this amount of firepower as I go to this other video.
Oh, yeah.
You can see here. So here's another Russian BMP. You can see they're putting all kinds of rounds up into this house on the top right of the screen here. Yes, that is the way you do it. So ideally, you've got the infantry and the engineers now moving up through those buildings so they can approach the objective while that armored fighting vehicle is putting rounds into it in order to keep heads down and start destroying adversary positions inside that building.
Would you
That
say that this also enables us to have like that shock action as a ground force?
Yes, very much so. Yes, very much so. Um, and my good friend, Dr. Charles Knight, he's down in Australia. He's an urban warfare historian and a defense scientist and a researcher. I love this comment. It's time for this reminder that with sufficient HE, the standard of your close quarter shooting drills doesn't determine who survives. So I go back to this video that Charles provided. Remember I talked about breaching the objective? Ideally, this is what, there we go. This is what the engineers are doing. Okay, this is, okay, before the infantry and the engineers go in, that's the kind of stuff. So you can imagine close air support, artillery, air defense, mortars in the direct fire role, armor in the direct fire role, and then the engineers breach into using those. I want the infantry and the engineers to walk into a room and just start counting bodies. They don't need to pull the triggers anymore because the bad guys are dead. Okay, this is the kind of stuff that we need to see. Not this coin tactics where you're stacking outside of a room and blah, blah, blah. As soon as the engineers throw the explosives in, you rush in and you start counting the bodies. That's the conventional peer-on-peer urban operations tactics I want to start seeing. And we need to focus on the larger stuff. Okay, the larger planning tactics and sustainment. The urban operations planners course down in Los Angeles, again, focused on that. So this right here, sorry, just go back. This right here is good. This is only half the solution. This is only half the solution. We need to get the higher officers, the senior officers, the officers, and the senior NCOs smart on the planning tactics and sustainment from the combat team to division level. That's another thing we have to improve on because there's not enough of these courses around the world. In fact, there's very few, if any, now. All right. We need to understand new technologies like UAVs and artificial intelligence, robotics quicker so we can integrate them into the urban battle space well. So as you already know, starting to sing, I like technology. Technology doesn't like me. And I'm very excited to see some of the new technologies that are coming out because I want to see how they can be integrated into urban warfare. My Irish urban operations brother from another mother, Stu Lyle, right now, he's got his eyebrows raised because up in the top left corner, you see that robot dog? Yeah. In the top left corner. They're not very good for urban operations. Stu's done a lot of work and research. And so I'm putting it up there now at the risk of angering my friends too. But robot dogs are not necessarily good in urban operations at all. But there's a lot of other technologies out there. I'm very interested to see what AI can do. Right. I'm very interested in seeing UAVs have been ubiquitous now on the battlefield for almost 40, 50 years. While we've had uncrewed vehicles since the Second World War, but really in the late 20th century and now in this first 25 years of the 21st century, uncrewed aerial vehicles and uncrewed ground vehicles now and uncrewed surface vehicles for the on the water, those are becoming more and more popular. And so I'm very excited to see what kind of technologies come forth that enable victory in an urban operation. And I like Dr. Evans' comment there that it's not going to be the silver bullet, but it's going to be a key force multiplier. So we need to get smart. We need to get smarter on integrating, more UAVs and artificial intelligence and other kinds of technologies into the urban front.
Absolutely, sir. Which conflicts would you point out as being the best examples of where we may see the latest technology being rolled out? The Russia-Ukraine war being one of them. Uh,
Yes, right there, Russia-Ukrainian war. And the Israelis are also learning a lot from the Israeli-Hamas conflict as well. But those two wars at the present are the best examples. And you go on social media and you can see all kinds of really nifty things that all sides are doing when it comes to bringing technology into the server fund. Yes, those two wars in particular. Hey, we really need to get, yeah, no worries. We need to get our sustainment needs sorted out. Amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics, right? So right now I'm looking at the section 2 ICs, the platoon warrants, the company sergeant majors, the company 2 ICs, the RQs. These are the folks but I'm also looking at the sergeants and the lieutenants and the majors and the lieutenant colonels who are leading the fight, because you can have the greatest tactical plan in the world, but if you can't sustain it, then your plan sucks, right? So I mentioned earlier about how there's some consumables that are used in great quantity, while there's other consumables that aren't. So throughout my urban warfare historical research, I find the challenging thing is that there's no operational research that's been done to verify. There's no paper out there or work out there that says or that produces a lot of numbers to back up the evidence. But what we do have is a lot of participants of urban warfare battles who say, yes, we used a lot of ammunition, we used a lot of water, we used more medical supplies because we did have higher casualties, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of ammunition, lots of water, lots of rations, medical supplies, and commodity points close to the urban area with armored fighting vehicles driving them in and then withdrawing the casualties concurrently. That's in most urban warfare battles. Sergeant Singh, do you know who General Hal Moore is?
yes, yes, I was more familiar with him as Colonel Helmore in his
Yes.
Vietnam campaign.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, that's right. He was the commanding officer of 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and 1st Air Cavalry Division in the Battle of the Ia Drang in November 1965 during the Vietnam War. And of course, he wrote his book, right? We Were Soldiers, once young, and that got turned into a movie called We Were Soldiers. It's funny, whenever I ask the question who General Hal Moore is, the answer I usually get is Mel Gibson, because 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 of course that's who Mel Gibson was playing in that movie. So I'm going to be a bit risky here, and I want to give out some numbers to you when it comes to casualties, ammunition, rations, of water. But I want you to use these numbers as start states only. You have to do a good intelligence preparation of the operational environment in the city, in the urban environment, to determine the final numbers. But I suggest as a start state when it comes to planning that usually urban operations will incur 3 to 6 times the amount of casualties. Sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on the operational plan, the TTPs, the PPE, et cetera, the adversary, the density of the urban terrain, what the urban terrain is made out of, et cetera. Plan for 3 to 6 times the amount of casualties. Plan for 4 times the amount of ammunition. You might need more. You might need 8 times the amount. You might need 3 times the amount. Plan for 4 times the amount of certain types of ammunition. Urban operations is usually very hungry and thirsty work. So our bodies use about 2,000 calories a day just to do our normal routines. Urban operations, you've got dismounted soldiers in particular, running across streets, running upstairs, crawling through subterranean systems, boosting their buddies through the doors and windows. So usually in urban operations, dismounted infantry engineers will use 5,000 calories a day. So that's 1.5 times the amount of normal rations and water that you would normally consume. So if you have to order 2.5 times rations of water, that means instead of 1 CamelBak of water per soldier per day, you're going to be using 3 CamelBaks of water per soldier per day. 3 meals a day is not going to cut it. So you're going to have to eat 6 to 8 IMPs per day. Well, nobody wants to eat 6 to 8 IMPs. So you're going to have fresh rations brought up on a daily basis because fresh rations have more calories than our IMPs do. Our individual meal packets for folks listening are our military rations, right? And so now the logistics of that go, oh my God, if Geroux is saying 3 to 6 times the amount of casualties, that's going to increase the number of medical supplies. If Geroux is saying 4 times the amount of ammunition, that's going to increase the number of drivers and trucks we need to bring the ammunition up. If we have 2.5 times the issue of rations of water, we're going to need more drivers and trucks to bring all the rations of water up. And how are we going to do that? Right. And so this is now again, those numbers could be higher or lower depending on the IPOE, but use those numbers as start states so that you can go into this fight having more. So what I always like to say is that at the strategic, operational, tactical levels, it's not just Section 2IC that has to worry about this, but we're talking like the Brigade G4 and the Division G4. They have to worry about this too. Um, a lot of ammunition, and a lot of water, and a lot of ammo, and a lot of ammo, and a lot of water and ammunition and water and ammo, and ammo and water and ammo and water and grenades and ammo and water and ammo and water. And don't forget about the ammunition and the water. And Sergeant saying, make sure you have lots of ammunition and water, because those two consumables in particular you're going to go through a lot of ammunition and water in particular when you're fighting a server fight. I see it in a lot of urban warfare battles. A lot of participants are like, I can't believe how much ammunition we went through. And we went through a lot of water as well, and grenades. So Battle Ortona, the battalion from the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the Loyal Eddies. This is just the Loyal Eddies in 8 days of fighting. This is the numbers that they generated when they were fighting through Ortona.
Wow.
This is just the Loyal Eddies. Talking about the Seaforths, who were also involved in this fight, right? So you can see those numbers there, right? Same with the Battle of Aachen. The Americans went through all of these numbers. This is only the 2nd Battalion. I'm not even talking about the 3rd Battalion that was involved. 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Daryl Daniel, this is what his troops went through when it came to fighting from the 12th to the 21st of October in 1944 in the city of Aachen. And
That's incredible.
good friend John Spencer will appreciate. Yeah, my good friend John Spencer will appreciate the 50 gallons of flamethrower fuel there because he's same with the Second Battle of Fallujah. You see the number of close air support strikes and the number of artillery mortar rounds, the number of main battle tank rounds. Look at the ammunition, 300%. Now the Americans had 11 million rounds of ammunition when they started this fight, but they went through 300% more than anticipated. 50 caliber ammunition and the fragmentation grenades. Look at all those numbers. Really high numbers. When the Loyal Eddies were fighting in Ortona, they gave each individual infantry soldier 12 to 15 grenades per day. That was a daily issue. So yeah, you go through a lot of ammunition and grenades, and a lot of water in these fights, right? And the great thing too about the Battle of Aachen, which those two photos on the left, and the Battle of Second Fallujah on the right, is that the Americans had commodity points right outside the cities. And as the Americans pushed through the city, these commodity points were like 2 or 3 city blocks behind. And so this way, because if you're going through that much of ammunition and that much water, and you're having that much casualties, you need to be able to get all that up, and you have to get the casualty back, right? So these commodity points were extremely close, 2 to 3 city blocks beyond the front lines, so that they could get all that stuff up. And the Americans did it well at Aachen, and they did that well at Second Fallujah. Again, these are the points to improve. Again, I've seen it in the past and the present. If we can improve these points, we can make ourselves better for future operations. Before I move to points to sustain, Sergeant Singh, did you have any questions or comments or any additional supporting fires there for anything I've talked about so far?
You had a slide that basically illustrated a lot of different urban battles over the generations and decades. And I found that interesting when you think about the locations of all these places, because these environmental conditions impact a lot of things too. Like, are you going from an amphibious assault into an urban battle?
Mm.
You going from an open country environment into an urban battle? Are you going from the desert, the jungle, like all these kind of considerations? Like right now, the Arctic is becoming a huge focus for our military. And we'll get to explore the idea of Arctic sustainment in general to get good at that. And then now you add this complexity of urban fighting and, I don't know, like Stalingrad, I'm not a huge history, student,
Good.
but, when I think about Stalingrad, there's an immense amount of casualties and devastation that occurred in that campaign, so I just hope that we do everything we can, in our power to really try to do the best we can to prepare, mentally, tactically, logistically.
Is
Yeah. Sorry, that's only real comment. There's so much to improve on, like many things, trying to be a student of warfare, whether you're at the hands and feet position or you're higher up in the operation or strategic positions. But we all have a lot to do to get together, to collaborate, to make this all work. And we all got to kind of be on the same page, and in our attitude towards it if we really want to be prepared, because I can't help but feel since Afghanistan and trying to adapt from a global war on terror nickname of coin operations to like conventional near peer fighting, it's so different. And it was a culture shock too. I still remember like the OPIs of training saying statements like, "This isn't Afghanistan anymore." And you could see that some people it rubbed them in the wrong way because that took a cultural adaptation period where it's like, this is very important knowledge and skills that we just learned and we paid for it in blood. And it's like,
Oh, yeah.
but we have to break away from that mentality of fighting so we can really be flexible to adapt to what we're really here to do and fight a beast of an enemy that's a conventional force. Sir,
Yeah.
I think about Maple Resolve 2014, sir. I was embedded with the PsyOps team, and of all the people I had to support, it was 2 service battalion with 2 RCR as the main security element. And what was so fascinating to me was like me and everybody else who have our careers for the most part siloed in an infantry battalion if you're a junior rank, especially in NCM. It's hard for them to fathom how complex the battlefield can be. And when I was in that psyops job, it's really when I really got to see this big picture element of war and seeing that there could be a conventional belligerent force that our primary infantry battalions are moving forward to engage with. But as we advance the battlefield, hopefully in our favor, and we keep pushing the enemy back, there's a huge rear area that continues to grow and grow. And that's its own problem. And that's where you could find an insurgency developing behind your forces. And so the idea of sustainment and security and leveraging speed to continue to try to conquer your enemy is such a complex formula, sir. That I understand that there's so many players. You have your main force. You could potentially have an insurgency, paramilitary groups operating behind you, and yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Well, thank you. And the funny thing is, the deep fight with the long range fires and the technologies that are out there now, like nobody's safe, right? So you're talking about, an insurgency in the back or conventional forces could be in your backside too. Nowhere is safe. And, I do appreciate your earlier point of, the various environments. You mentioned desert and Arctic, and then we got rural and mountain and urban. What's funny is that you'll find urban in all of those environments, but
Right.
you can find a city in a desert. You'll find cities in Canadian, small, very towns and villages in the Canadian North, in the Arctic, right? You'll find them in the jungle, right? And so urban crosses the breadth of the environment, which is why another argument that we're going to be doing more urban more because regardless of where you go in the world, there's a city there for the most part.
And sorry, what, that being said, what I find that's important too, and I don't know if this was a really like a strategic lesson learned, but like holding the population is just as important as holding the physical ground. And
Yes.
I don't know if it's conducive for us to level the entire city at the cost of trying to conquer the enemy. And what does that leave for us in terms of the long term? If you're just turning every city into what Mosul became, just a
Yes.
rubble ruin.
Yeah, and actually, that's one of my points to sustain that some militaries now are getting better at making
Yeah.
sure that they can revitalize a city afterwards. So actually, you'll see it very shortly in my points to sustain. All right, so let's kick off with that. Okay, urban operations will become more prevalent. So again, sorry, this is what I've seen in the past and the present that we'll be able to continue on in the future. Make us good at this. Urban operations will become more prevalent. More militaries are recognizing this reality. Now, you still have to remember points 3 and 4. Points 3 was we still have to take the generalist approach while dedicating more resources to urban operations training and urban warfare training. We still have to take that generalist approach. So we're ready. And remember point four being is that it's not just about the hands and feet skills. It's not, and try to get away from the coin tactics, get to the large scale combat operations tactics that we need. And remember, now that this particular urban operations plans course is defunct, we still need courses like this. So, yes, it's good that more militaries are recognizing that urban operations is becoming more prevalent and they're doing more of this, but we now need to do more than this. This course was a point to sustain. We need to do more courses like this. So I'm hoping other militaries around the world are developing courses like this in particular. So, because once you got this down, then you can do that more confident. Right? And keep stuff like that. I'll go to exercise Urban Falcon, 48 Highlanders out of Toronto. Oh, sorry, Toronto. Um, so in 2021, the commanding officer, a good friend of mine, Lieutenant Colonel Jayson Geroux, asked myself and my senior NCO fire team partner, Warrant Officer Peter Vandermalen. He's with the Patricias, and he's an urban operations instructor. And he was actually the he was actually the urban operations. He was the lead for the urban operations and instructor cell down at the infantry school. And Colonel Marisha said he wanted me to come up and teach the higher planning tactics and sustainment to the officers and warrant officers. And meanwhile, Warrant Vandermalen was out on the armory floor and he was teaching the privates to the sergeants all the hands and feet skills. So you had the entire unit was now engaged. And then in 2022, 2023, unfortunately, Warrant Vandermalen couldn't pick it up, but they were able to get some UOI from either 1 or 3 RCR to come down. And what they did was they had acquired the use of an abandoned portion of the Toronto Transit Commission subway system where they were doing simunition training, force on force simunition training. So while that was going on, I built an urban operations package in Toot, situated in downtown Toronto, using that same subterranean system so that the officers and the warrant officers could come up with their cunning offensive and defensive plans, depending on what syndicate they're on. So they've done this now for 3 years. It's absolutely fantastic because the whole unit's now engaged. It's not just about the hands and feet skills, but we've got the officers and the warrant officers now learning the higher planning tactics. So if more units can do this, then I think that's absolutely fantastic. Get the whole unit engaged.
Sir, I was actually in Toronto. I was adjacent to you guys at Fort York at the time. I was posted to a unit down there, Royal Regiment of Canada. And I was kind of jealous that we weren't involved in that training. And I don't know why we weren't or were. But with that being said, I found that that training that the 40th Highlanders put together, uh, a lot of it was driven on initiative for them to
Yep.
want to make it happen, so it happened. And I found that the
Yeah.
brigades would benefit from this type of training 'cause we don't do it enough, and I can't help but feel like if we really want to achieve economy of effort and concentration of force while we're doing the training, and for the betterment of the whole institution, like, we should try to maybe make it happen at a higher level so we all get to
Yes,
participate. That would be great.
it would be. And you know what? It's funny. It started saying every 1 or 2 weeks, I get a request to teach urban operations at the higher level or to talk about an urban warfare historical battle. It's all bottom up requests. It's not something that's being driven from at the strategic level. It's not, it's the stuff that's, all these units from around the world. It's not like they're receiving direction to go out and find an urban operations guy. They don't do that. They just use their initiative and they contact me and I'm able to go online or actually travel to their location to teach urban operations, planning, tactics, sustainment, or talk about urban warfare history or both. So yeah, it's very much a bottom up thing right now, but I'm hoping at some point that, top down will start to happen.
Yeah, hope so too.
So more militaries are slowly understanding this is a multi-branch and a multi-arms fight. Okay. Uh, you need the Army, you need the Navy, Air Force, Marines, if your country has them, Special Forces, and then you need the combat support, you need the combat arms, combat support, and the combat service support trades. Again, you have to take the generalist approach, but you still need to get smarter regardless of your trade. Right now, here's the urban legend, pun intended. Urban operations, that's an army thing. And then within the army, oh yeah, it's all about clearing rooms. So really, that's just an infantry thing. No, no, no. The reality is that you need all of these branches and all of these occupations to get smart on this environment. You need all of them. Okay, you're not just going to win this if you just go in with the infantry. That's the quickest way to lose. Whenever I see urban operations training exercises, the first thing I ask is, who else do you have involved? Is it just infantry guys and gals? Because if it is, I think you failed before you even begun the training. So you need everybody involved. Oh, Major Geroux, I'm a signaler. I'm a military police officer. What do I do? How do I get myself smart on this? Major Geroux to the rescue. Okay. You go to my urban operations doctrinal publication. I talk about all of these branches and trades in my urban operations doctrinal publication, the challenges that they're going to face and some of their mitigations, their abilities that they bring to the urban fight, and the employment conditions that you need to enact to make sure that they conduct the urban fight properly. So if you're a signaler, a military police officer, you're a sailor, you're an aviator, you're a special forces member, you're in the artillery, if you're infantry recce, if you're snipers, if you're whatever, if whatever job you do, I've got it in this doctrinal publication so you can get yourself smart on how to fight this fight. Battle Ramadi, an insurgency, counterinsurgency urban operation. But you can see Ramadi in the top left corner. It's got the Habanaya Canal and the Euphrates River that cut through it. Colonel Sean McFarland of the Ready First Brigade recognized this was not just an army fight. So he brought Navy because the insurgency started using the Euphrates River and the Habanaya Canal as a logistical means. So he brought in the Navy, brought in the Marines, Special Forces to patrol the rivers. He had Air Force elements involved. He had armor. He had infantry. He had all the trades. So, and this was a months-long urban operations battle because it's in a counterinsurgency context. But the Ready First Brigade did a fantastic job bringing in all of the branches and all of the occupations to fight this fight. Same with the Battle of Marawi in the Philippines. The Air Force of the Philippines, Marawi is situated on Lake Lanao. And so it wasn't just an army fight, even though they have a very small Navy of just a few watercraft. Those watercraft were critical to prevent the insurgency from getting any logistics across the water and into the city. And they also had the Air Force. There was a couple of friendly force close airstrikes where there were casualties. But once they sorted that out, they were using the Air Force on a regular basis. Most cities and urban areas are built on large bodies of water or waterways, unless you're the mafia building Las Vegas. Most cities are built on waters or waterways, and all cities have airspace above them, right? So this is an Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, if your country has them, and Special Forces fight. And all those other combat support and combat service support trades, they got to get involved. They got to get smarter. And so we're slowly beginning to see that point to sustain, which is great.
Sir, there's like that famous incident that happened in Iraq where was it the Jessica Lynch story? And I might be messing this up, where she was in a logistics convoy and it took a wrong turn and ended up in a place where they did not want to be. And
That's right.
with you not being the primary fighting component of the ground force, you'll find yourself overwhelmed really quickly. And I think that's principally what happened. A logistical element found themselves in a situation that they were not prepared to deal with and were potentially overwhelmed to a point where they were captured and people were killed. And so that's what would happen to you if, you know what I mean? You take a wrong turn and you decide that mentally you don't need to be as invested because there's these other people doing those jobs. But when you cross the line of departure, where it's all hands on deck and everybody can suffer the consequences.
Right. And that's why in my doctrinal publication, I say to the readers, if you're logistics, you better learn how to clear rooms. If you're an EME, you better learn how to clear rooms. If you're medical, you better learn how to defend yourself. Because in the urban environment, the enemy uses a subterranean system and they pop up behind you. Or you're an artillery who party, you better learn how to clear rooms because your artillery OP is probably going to be on that third level of that floor up there, the third level of that building right there, right? So, everybody needs to. And so who are you going to go to? You're going to go to the infantry and say, infantry, you need to teach us how to clear rooms. Okay, we can do that. But then that, of course, adds on to the training, et cetera. So now the infantry got to be dedicated to doing that, right? So there's ripple effects to these recommendations, certainly. All right. More countries and militaries are slowly understanding that civilians, humanitarian organizations, and media are part of the urban battlefield. So this is a problem you cannot wish away and you cannot ignore. So I'll talk about there are civilians on the urban battlefield. Throughout my urban warfare historical research studies, I find that on average, about 10% of a population of a city will not leave, even if they know an urban battle is coming. I have nowhere to go. The mean Canadians are going to steal all my personal possessions, so I've got to stay here to guard them all. I'll just wait in the basement and wait for the urban storm to pass me by. These are some of the reasons why civilians will remain in the urban battlefield. They will assume that risk, or it's more of a gamble than a risk. There are media in the urban battlefield. Journalists are there to do a job, and they're there to report the news. And urban fighting is very exciting stuff. And so if they're there, they're going to want to do their jobs. Humanitarian organizations are there because the civilians are there. And these humanitarian organizations be very powerful and have a fantastic reach. And so they're there to help the civilians. If there's going to be civilians in the urban battlefield, you can guarantee there's going to be humanitarian organizations there as well. And so commanders and planners have to work with these three groups of non-combatants so that the urban operations can be successful. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, Sergeant Singh. So I was teaching urban operations, the combat team commanders course, and we had the infantry company sergeant majors course from the infantry school down, co-located. And so we had the two courses in-house. And I was doing the urban operations package, and one of my deliverables was that the combat team had to have a proactive plan to safely remove civilians when, not if, but when they're discovered on the urban battlefield. How are you going to get the civilians and the casualties out, and how are you going to bring the bullets and the beans forward as part of your sustainment plan? So the senior officers of the combat team commanders, that left to the junior officers and the warrant officers from the sergeant major's course to work on the sustainment plan. And for this one combat team, one of the warrant officers backread the sustainment plan. It was a good sustainment plan. Yep, bullet beans forward, casualties back, but neglected to tell me what the proactive plan was for civilians in the urban battle space. And that was one of my deliverables. I made it very clear. And so I said to the warrant, warrant, great sustainment plan. You're missing that one critical element of what happens when you run into civilians on the urban battlefield. How are you going to get them to the rear? Are you going to use an armored vehicle? Are you going to walk them to the rear? You just can't say, well, go that way. And somebody back there cares, because they're going to hear that burst of machine gun fire, or that artillery round's going to land. They're going to run into a building. And so they're still your problem. So I said, what are you going to do?
It's a very good point. Very good point, sir.
Well, you kind of feel the awkward silence right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the awkward silence. Like there was this, and he just looked at me with this deer caught in the headlights kind of look. And I could hear the wheels turning inside of his head. He didn't have an answer. Right. So I'm like, warrant officer, what are you going to do about the civilians? Well, that's okay, sir. They're just going to leave. And I looked at him and I said, say again, what? They're just going to leave. And I said, well, no, warrant, they're not just going to leave. You're going to have some civilians that stay on the urban battlefield. That was one of my points I brought up earlier. That's why I have to have a proactive plan for civilians on the battlefield. Oh, no, sir, you're wrong. They're just going to leave. I didn't have to say anything because there was a sergeant major. He was the standard sergeant major for the urban operations instructors course. And I didn't have to say anything that sergeant major launched on scoring off. You don't just say, tell Major Geroux he's wrong. And I was like, all right, Sergeant Major, we're good. We get the point. Good. Thanks for coming to my defense, but okay, we're good. Okay, the warrant officer had just wished the problem away. He had just wished the problem away. Oh, they're just going to leave. No, they're not. No, they're not. You have to be prepared. You have to be prepared on this battlefield to deal with civilians, humanitarian organizations, and media. And not all of them are cooperative, which makes it even more challenging. So, but Major Geroux, how do I do that? How do I do that? Well, once again, there are resources you can look at and review, and I'll tell you how to do this stuff and do it successfully. Yeah. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, has produced this Commander's Handbook. The Civilians in Center, Civilians in Conflict NGO has produced this primer on civilian harm mitigation and urban operations. My good friend Dr. Knight, with his colleague Dr. Katya Theodorakis, talks about the Battle of Marawi and how to work information operations in the media. And then on the right side, the Armed Forces of the Philippines Operational Research Center punched out this booklet on how they used social media and media to their advantage in the Battle of Marawi. So let's go to this ICRC handbook. I was reading it and I realized, like at the tactics school and at the college in Kingston, we teach the estimate as a planning tool to come up with our cunning operational plan. Now, as I was reading this handbook, I was noticing that the material was very familiar to the estimate process. And I was like, this is absolutely fantastic. And I was reading this and I'm like, why does there's military speak and military language in this Red Cross book? And I'm thinking somebody in the military wrote this. And sure enough, I find out that it was a very senior British retired officer who was now part of the ICRC who had written the book. And I'm like, this is fantastic. This is like those books for dummies that you find at Indigo or Chapters. This is like civilian harm mitigation for commanders and planners. All the details that you need in order to make sure that you can reduce civilian harm within an urban operation. This is absolutely fantastic. And then my good friend Sahar Muhammad Ali, she's an American young lady down in the United States who's probably seen more combat than a lot of soldiers because she's been all over the world helping out civilians in urban warfare. She wrote this primer on a primer on civilian harm mitigation in urban operations, and where she has a checklist, amongst many other planning points. She actually has a checklist for attacking forces and defenders when fighting in urban warfare so you can mitigate civilian harm. Absolutely fantastic, right? So the resources are out there to tell military community planners how to do this. Okay, the Battle of Marawi in the Philippines, great example. The Armed Forces of the Philippines has some tough challenges in the first week of this fight. But then they sucked back, came up with a good operational plan, good TTPs, and then they came up with a very proactive plan on how to work with the media and information operations and the civilians throughout this particular urban battle. So first of all, the Islamic State took to social media and they started pumping out their messages. And these are some of the messages that they were pumping out to try to convince people that they were correct for attacking and taking the citadel of Marawi in the Philippines. You've got all these messages being punched out on Facebook that are now influencing not only the civilian population, but international audiences all over the world, right? And so the Armed Forces of the Philippines recognized that these kinds of messages and these kinds of messages that you see here, these were only going to work against the Armed Forces of the Philippines and in being able to achieve their mission at strategic, operational, and tactical levels. All right, so what they did was they created a Civil Military Operations Coordinating Center, or CMOC, that was in charge by a colonel, and then they started punching out their own social media messaging at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels so that they could fight this information operations campaign against the Islamic State, right? Which is because this is how, social media is how we get most of our news now, right? If you want to find out what's going on in the Russo-Ukrainian war and the Israeli-Hamas conflict, the regular media is only going to tell you so much and maybe not even enough. Go to social media and you can find out a lot quicker, right? And so very quickly, Air Force, the Philippines, and the CMOC were creating social media messages. What they were also doing, though, is they actually had a dedicated team of soldiers to scour social media sites. And anything they found that was pro-ISIS, they contacted the Facebook and the other social media sites, and they shut those profiles down. So you couldn't read what the Islamic State was putting out, because this is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for weeks on end. That's all this group was doing. Just look at social media, find the pro-Islamic State profiles and shut them down. And then they backed up their actions with words and their words with actions. The Armed Forces of the Philippines went out and they rescued civilians. They conducted humanitarian operations. They provided over 68 camps to all the refugees and their families. If there was any civilian dead because they were Muslims, they made sure that they received the proper burial procedures, and they conducted successful combat operations against ISIS fighters. That went out in videos on media and social media, trying to win that information operations campaign, right? Absolutely fantastic. They also set up a 24-hour-a-day media center where you could talk to military personnel any time of the day that you want. And that allowed the Armed Forces of the Philippines to create a positive image amongst themselves, amongst the media, and they could influence the media to pass their message on, vice the Islamic State. So they were accessible. They allowed the military to be accessible to the media. And then even civilians could get on it, where they could write messages, personal messages to the soldiers of the front line, and the soldiers could look up on the media and see personal messages that were supported. Like, wow, what a fantastic plan. So it went even further. So it wasn't just social media, but leaflet drops, banners, radio loudspeakers. They were using Class 1 UAVs with cell phones. They were flying them forward. They would see a group of civilians. That UAV would come down. The civilians would grab the phone. Of course, they got a camera on there, so you could see the civilian grab the phone. The phone would ring. Hey, can you tell us where the adversary is? And stay there. We're coming to get you so we can rescue you. Right? And the messages were all, this is not a Christian-Muslim fight. The Islamic State was like the Catholic Christians of the Philippines have been suppressing the Muslims, for decades. No, the Armed Forces of the Philippines want to make sure this has nothing to do with religion. This is bad guys doing bad things, and we're the good guys, and we're going to do good things, and we're going to rescue civilians and work with the media. This is not a Christian versus Muslim thing. This is us trying to save human lives. Right. So these are good, and it turned out to work out very positively for them. But because they had proactive plans, they developed these proactive plans on civilian care, on how to work with the media, on information operations. This is the template. So this is what we need to sustain for the future. Right. So if we can do that now, we're slowly coming around to that.
Oh, sir, very interesting when I consider the Philippine example, because that's an example where you're kind of conducting an offensive operation, an urban operation in your home country. Right? So you have to be very mindful of the impacts on the civilian population, because no matter what happens, like, you're gonna live with it for forever, or until your country no longer exists. So that was a very interesting, point that I thought of, like, when I'm thinking about this Philippine example, and that you can't have collateral damage, that you'd probably be more willing to accept maybe in a foreign country than you would at home, where you would be killing your own population, and that's not good for business.
Wow, your comments are so prescient. Your comments are like foreshadows, because the very next point is exactly that. What another point we have to sustain, their starting thing, is that we have to understand, we're slowly understanding that the planning of the resources, you can't just focus on the trigger pulling.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to have good planning. And because of the density of the urban terrain and the complexities and the challenges, I'm suggesting you need weeks, if not months, of planning before you launch into an urban fight. The first battle of Fallujah, they had a couple days and they fouled it up. They sucked back. They did several months of planning. And then several months later, they did the second battle of Fallujah. And that planning, demonstrated that why they were successful. But so you have to spend the time, because time's a resource, and you have to plan and get the resources for pre-battle, present battle, and post-battle needs. Now, at the Battle of Mari, there was a lot of collateral damage, because the Islamic State was very stubborn in its defense of the city. But the Armed Forces of the Philippines has been slowly rebuilding Mari. But I've got better examples here on, if you're going to have a lot of collateral damage, you have to have the proactive plan already in place to fix the city, to revitalize the city afterwards. People got to come back at some point and live there, right? So let's talk about that. So here's my Urban Operations Doctrinal publication again. There's 11 chapters. The first 8 chapters are all about planning before and planning for after battle. Okay, you need the pre-battle and the post-battle planning in there. And of course, I talked about what you have to do during the battle, but there's planning that goes on during the battle as well, right? So if you read my first 8 chapters, I will set 2 up for success, hopefully, when it comes to pre-battle and post-battle needs and present battle needs as well. Okay, let's look at the Battle of Rotona. Okay, now during the Second World War and the Italian campaign, the Allies had formed a unit called the Allied Military Government of the Occupied Territories, AMGOT. And what it was a military unit that would plan before the battle to bring in resources. And then during the battle, if they had the capabilities, they would move into the city to start helping the civilians out. And then after the battle, they would dump a lot of resources into the city to revitalize the city. And there were Canadians that were part of the AMGOT as well. So at the Battle of Rotona, for example, once the Canadians, they did the pre-planning. It was a small town or city, so they couldn't go in during the fight because of artillery and all and because of the violence that was being perpetuated. But after the Battle of Rotona happened, the Canadians went in as part of AMGOT. And first of all, they removed all the politicians who were fascists, removed the fascist government. Then they started removing rubble, demining, removal of UXO. They were inspecting buildings to make sure the buildings wouldn't collapse. They were cleaning up the houses. They stopped the looting. They were cleaning up the water wells to make sure the water was drinkable. They were giving livestock and medical support to the civilians as they came back into the city. They were providing food, they're providing water to the civilians. At some point, they started having social evenings where, you could go watch films. There were bingo nights and dances, and they were paying civilians. They were pumping money back into the economy, paying civilians to do laundry, paying civilians for tailoring, paying civilians for haircuts. And soon the civilians started reciprocating. Soon they started inviting Canadian soldiers in for home cooked meals and for language lessons, et cetera, right? So it's not just about pulling triggers and destroying the enemy. It's what the strategic and the operational leaders, both political and military, are doing to make sure that we can revitalize the city afterwards and rebuild the city, even if there's a lot of collateral damage. Right? Second Battle of Fallujah, fantastic example. So my good friends, John Spencer and Liam Collins, have written Understanding Urban Warfare. That's the book at the bottom of the screen. And what they've done is take a number of podcasts and converted them into chapters. And for this book,
Right.
John talked to Colonel Leonard DeFranceschi, who was in charge of the 3rd Civil Affairs Group with Regimental Combat Team Number 1, which fought on the western side of Fallujah. Before the Americans fought the second battle, they liaised with civilians before, during, and after. They provided food, water, and blankets, provided medical support. They located all the critical infrastructure that they didn't want to destroy. And then during the battle, they removed civilians from the fight safely. They assessed building damages. They removed the dead. Because it's beside the river, the large river there was some flooding going on. So they made sure that the sewer lift stations and that the dam that controlled the river was working or providing fuel for it so that they could keep the streets dry. That was during the battle. Then after the battle, they jump-started the economy. They dumped $6.6 million worth of money into the city to start revitalizing the city. They rebuilt damaged houses. They restored essential services like water, electrical, medical, fuel, financial, police, fire, garbage, transportation. They removed all the rubble. They provided rations to the civilians. Like a fantastic pre-battle, present battle, and post-battle plan that Colonel DeFranceschi discusses as part of his as leader of the 3rd Civil Affairs Group. Fantastic. That's what we need to see more often so that we can get these cities back up and running after the battle ends. Oh, Dr. Russell Glenn is a good friend of mine. I call him the Yoda of urban operations because he's talking about urban operations for like 40 years now. He's written 2 fantastic books. Come Hell or High Fever. Come Hell or High Fever is about preparing cities for disasters. And then Brutal Catalyst is, okay, here's what Ukraine has to do to revitalize their cities now and after the Russia-Ukrainian war ends, right? So here's Dr. Glenn taking the lead on that. So again, there's no lack of resources on how to do this properly. We can sustain this point to continue successful urban operations by looking at pre-battle, present battle, and post-battle needs. All right. Sergeant Singh, we're wrapping things up now. Come to a conclusion. I started off this lecture with an excerpt from the introduction of Colonel DeMarco's book, Concrete Hell. I bookend it with an excerpt from the conclusion of his same book, but Colonel DeMarco's got it right. We need to get smarter on urban operations. Not everybody and their dog, but given the trends, we need to get everybody smarter on urban operations and urban warfare because it obviously is becoming more prevalent, not at the expense of not being able to do the other fighting in the other environments, but just given the trends and the rapid urbanization of the world, we're probably going to be conducting urban operations. It behooves us to learn how to fight in this environment. And as Colonel DeMarco said, there's enough resources out there from history that can help you do that.
Sir, this has been an incredible experience. Thank you so much. The regiment, the Army is very fortunate to have such passionate, dedicated professionals such as yourself.
Well, I could say the same thing about you, Sergeant Singh. I'm starting to understand why you won General Vance's award for leadership because it's very clear to me that you emulate the same passion for soldiering, and so well done you. In all honesty, and this has been a fantastic experience. And thank you very much for having me on.